In 1962, two cars released with turbochargers. These were the first turbocharged production cars. They were the Chevrolet Corvair Spyder and the Oldsmobile Jetfire. There had been a constant debate on which one was released first. Even Wikipedia contradicts themselves. Before we get into the actual answer, let's go over the history of the turbocharger, and then let's go over each car. The early forms of forced induction was through mechanically linked superchargers. These would run a belt from the crankshaft to the supercharger and would spin a big turbine within the supercharger housing, forcing air to be drawn through the intake. The difference between this and a turbocharger is that the supercharger is mechanically linked to the engine, meaning it would take a tiny bit of power from the engine to force more air in, whereas the turbocharger would spin up via exhaust gases, something that would have already been wasted. This means that turbochargers are better for power and fuel efficiency. Early turbochargers were used on aircraft due to the fact that the higher the altitude, the less air there is. One of the first uses of a turbocharger was on a World War I fighter called the LUSAC-11, where one of them was equipped with a turbocharger, where the plane would set an altitude world record of 3,113 feet, nearly killing the pilot in the process. Turbocharger technology got better over the decades and were used heavily on World War II on airplanes. One notable example is both the B-17 Flying Fortress and the P-47 Thunderbolt. Now, let's get onto the cars. The 1962 Oldsmobile Jetfire was a Oldsmobile Cutlass with a two-door pillarless hardtop. It used the same 215 cubic inch V8 from the normal Cutlass. However, it was equipped with a Garrett turbocharger, which brought up the horsepower from the standard 185 horsepower to 215 horsepower. That would be 1 horsepower per cubic inch. This also brought up the torque from 230 pound-feet of torque to 300 pound-feet. The Jetfire turbo system was very complex and ahead of its time in some ways. Because the very high compression ratio of the 215 engine, which would be 10.25 to 1, and along with the added turbocharger, it could not run at max power with pump gas. There was a tank in the engine bay where owners would add a thing called turbo rocket fluid, which was a mix of 50-50 of distilled water and menthol alcohol. If the owner had filled this tank with the fluid, the turbo would run at 5 psi. However, there was a system where a dual float valve assembly would alter the turbo in case the owner ran without the turbo rocket fluid. This would cause the turbocharger to run only at 1 psi, which wouldn't do anything. This system proved to be very complex. Most Jetfire owners chose to retrofit a standard 4-barrel carburetor instead of continuing to run with the turbocharger. The Jetfire was a very ambitious project, with really futuristic technology, such as water menthol injection, which was later seen by Saab in 1978. The 1962 Chevrolet Corvair Monza Spyder was a trim for the Corvair. It was available in a two-door coupe as well as a two-door convertible. Like all other Corvairs, the engine was rear-mounted, and it featured a 145 cubic inch, 2.4-liter flat-six air-cooled engine named the Turbo Air 6. It was named this across all of the engines and not just the turbocharged ones. The turbocharged engine produced a menacing 150 horsepower as well as 210 pound-feet of torque. The engine was slightly more power dense than the Jetfire at 1.03 horsepower per cubic inch. This nearly doubled the stock horsepower of 80. The compression was much lower compared to that of the Jetfire at 8.0 to 1. The engine also featured a relatively simple system that could automatically retard the timing in case of pre-ignition. The turbocharger also ran at a slightly higher PSI compared to the Jetfire, at 10 PSI, which would be doubled. This was possible due to the lower compression ratio. The Corvair also featured a very primitive wastegate, if you can call it one, where the exhaust restricts itself and create back pressure, preventing further pressure increase from the turbo. The system was much more durable and more reliable than the Jetfire. They opted to keep things simple. Around 50,000 Corvair turbos were made between 1962 and 1966, compared to only 9.6 thousand Jetfires, of which only around 100 are still around today with their original turbo setup, compared to a few thousand turbo Corvairs with their original setup. But which one came first? People have debated this for years. I have found 100% proof on which one released earlier. The 1962 April edition of the Popular Science magazine had an article about the turbocharged Corvair, which in it states, Oldsmobile proposes to solve this in its forthcoming F85 turbocharged engine without cutting back on the compression ratio. Forthcoming means that this is about to happen in the near future. This proves that the Corvair came first. You might think that the article was before the actual Corvair released, but on page 78 it says, I tested the car for Popular Science and got these performance figures in seconds. This shows that the car was already out and ready to buy before the Jetfire. In the end, they both had their own strengths and weaknesses. The Corvair was ever so slightly more power dense and it was much simpler. It also came out first and lasted the longest. It also didn't need a specialized fluid to run properly. The Jetfire, however, was much more technically advanced. Alas, it was like the later V864 by Cadillac. It was very technically advanced for its time, but it was way ahead and not there. The dual float system and menthol injection proved to be very unreliable for its time. However, modern engines use both variants of these, such as turbo maps and a more reliable form of menthol injection.